The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as Harold Thompson adjusted his worn military cap in the mirror. At 93 years old, his hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but they still knew exactly how to position the cap at the perfect angle. The collection of service pins that decorated it caught the early morning light, each one telling a story of bravery from long ago. Harold lived alone in a small, well-kept house on Maple Street. Every morning for the past 15 years, he had followed the same routine. Wake up at 6 a.m., do his morning exercises, modified now for his age, get dressed in his neatly pressed clothes, and walk the 3 blocks to Pete's Diner for breakfast. Today was no different. As he stepped out onto his front porch, Harold took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. His neighbors, the Wilsons, were already up and tending to their garden. Mrs. Wilson waved cheerfully, and Harold tipped his cap in response. Everyone in the small town of Millbrook knew Harold. He was as much a part of the town as the old oak tree in the town square. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Mr. Thompson?" called out Tommy, the paper boy, as he cycled past. Harold smiled and nodded. He had watched Tommy grow from a wobbly 7-year-old learning to ride his bike to a confident teenager who never missed a single house on his route. The walk to Pete's Diner took Harold exactly 12 minutes. He could have driven his old Buick that sat in the garage, but he believed walking kept him young. Besides, these morning walks gave him a chance to observe how his beloved town was waking up. He passed by Miller's Pharmacy, where Mr. Miller was setting up the sales sign in the window. The local florist, Sarah, was arranging fresh flowers outside her shop, and the smell of blooming roses filled the air. As Harold approached Pete's Diner, the familiar scent of bacon and coffee made his stomach rumble. The bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open, and several regular customers looked up with warm smiles. "Morning, Harold," Pete called from behind the counter, already reaching for Harold's favorite coffee mug, a slightly chipped blue one that had somehow become his over the years. "The usual, Pete," Harold said, making his way to his regular booth by the window. He liked this spot because it reminded him of the observation posts he used to man during the war. Old habits die hard, he thought to himself with a small chuckle. The usual was 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, 3 strips of bacon, and a small bowl of oatmeal with raisins. Harold had eaten the same breakfast for so long that Pete started preparing it the moment he saw Harold coming down the street. While waiting for his breakfast, Harold watched the diner's morning routine unfold. Linda, the waitress who had worked there since high school, buzzed between tables with coffee refills. Old Bill Jenkins sat at the counter, reading his newspaper and commenting on the day's headlines to anyone who would listen. The Martinez twins, both 8 years old, sat with their mother in the corner booth, their school backpacks ready for another day of learning. Pete brought over Harold's breakfast himself, as he did every morning. "Paper says it's going to be a warm one today," Pete mentioned, sliding the plate in front of Harold. The eggs were perfect, just like always. "Thank you, Pete," Harold said, unfolding his napkin onto his lap. "Weather doesn't bother me much these days, seen worse in the Pacific." A few regulars nearby nodded knowingly. They'd all heard pieces of Harold's war stories over the years, but they never tired of them. Harold wasn't one to brag, but occasionally, between bites of toast and sips of coffee, he'd share a memory from his time in service. What Harold didn't know, as he sat there enjoying his peaceful breakfast, was that this familiar routine was about to change dramatically. The rumble of motorcycles in the distance was about to bring a new chapter to his quiet life, one that would remind everyone in Millbrook that you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book had survived one of the greatest wars in history. The peaceful morning at Pete's Diner was shattered by the thunderous roar of motorcycle engines. The sound grew louder until 5 heavy bikes pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the sunlight. The riders, members of the Thunder Raiders Motorcycle Club, cut their engines but left behind a tense silence in the diner. Harold looked up from his newspaper as the bell above the door chimed 5 times in quick succession. The bikers walked in wearing black leather jackets covered in patches and chains that jingled with each step. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and sunglasses, scanned the diner before loudly declaring, "Looks like we found our new breakfast spot, boys." The other customers in the diner shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Martinez quickly gathered her twins and hurried them out the side door, leaving half-eaten pancakes behind. Old Bill Jenkins suddenly became very interested in his coffee cup, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The Thunder Raiders claimed the largest booth, their heavy boots scraping against the floor as they settled in. Linda, the waitress, approached their table with visible nervousness, her hands shaking slightly as she held her notepad. "What's good here, sweetheart?" the leader asked, his voice carrying across the entire diner. Before Linda could answer, he spotted Harold in his military cap. Well, what do we have here? Look, boys, we got ourselves a real-life relic." Harold continued eating his breakfast, maintaining his dignity as the bikers snickered. Pete watched the situation from behind the counter, his hand hovering near the phone, ready to call the police if things got out of hand. "Hey, Grandpa," one of the younger bikers called out. "Isn't it past your bedtime?" His friends laughed, high-fiving each other at what they thought was clever humor. Harold carefully wiped his mouth with his napkin and took another sip of coffee. His calm demeanor seemed to irritate the bikers even more. The leader, who introduced himself loudly as Snake, stood up and walked over to Harold's booth. "Those are some interesting pins you got there, old-timer," Snake said, leaning over Harold's table. "What are they from, the Civil War?" More laughter erupted from the bikers' table. "World War II," Harold replied quietly, still not looking up from his newspaper. "Pacific Theater." "Pacific Theater?" Another biker mocked. "What were you, an usher showing people to their seats?" The group roared with laughter, causing other customers to quickly pay their bills and leave. Snake reached out and flicked one of Harold's service pins with his finger. They sure made these things pretty back then. Probably handed them out just for showing up. Pete couldn't stand it anymore. "Now listen here," he started, but Harold raised his hand slightly, signaling Pete to stop. The old veteran had handled worse situations than this in his lifetime. The bikers ordered their breakfast, making sure to be as loud and disruptive as possible. They told crude jokes, made fun of the other customers, and deliberately spilled coffee on the floor for Linda to clean up. Throughout all this, Harold maintained his composure, finishing his breakfast as he did every morning. When he stood up to leave, Snake stuck out his boot, nearly tripping the old man. Harold caught himself on the edge of the table, his military reflexes still sharp despite his age. "Careful there, Pops," Snake said with a smirk. "Wouldn't want you to break a hip." As Harold walked to the counter to pay his bill, Pete whispered, "I'm calling the police next time, Harold. This isn't right." Harold shook his head and smiled slightly. "No need for that, Pete. Sometimes the best way to handle bullies is to wait for the right moment." There was something in Harold's eyes that Pete hadn't seen before, a glimmer of the young soldier he once was, planning his next move. What the Thunder Raiders didn't realize as they congratulated themselves on claiming their new territory was that they had just challenged the wrong veteran. Harold Thompson walked home that morning already forming a plan, one that would teach these young troublemakers a lesson they would never forget. The next few days at Pete's diner grew increasingly tense. The Thunder Raiders had made it their mission to make Harold's morning breakfast as unpleasant as possible. They arrived earlier each day, taking up more space and becoming bolder with their harassment. On this particular morning, Harold sat at his usual window booth, trying to enjoy his eggs and toast while the bikers loudly discussed modern warfare. Snake, their leader, made sure his voice carried across the diner as he spoke. "These old-timers had it easy," Snake proclaimed, pointing his fork in Harold's direction. "They probably spend more time polishing their boots than fighting. Not like today's soldiers who face real challenges." Harold's hand tightened slightly around his coffee cup, but his face remained calm. He had seen things during the war that would make these young troublemakers tremble, but he kept those memories to himself. The harassment took a nastier turn when one of the bikers, a man they called Razor, deliberately bumped Harold's table while walking past. The coffee cup tipped over, spilling hot coffee across the table and onto Harold's lap. The old veteran jumped up quickly, but some of the coffee had already soaked through his pants. "Oh, sorry there, old-timer," Razor said with a smirk. "Guess my hand slipped." The other bikers burst into laughter, some of them pounding the table with their fists. Linda rushed over with a cloth, her face red with anger. "That's enough," she said, helping Harold clean up. "You should be ashamed of yourselves. Stay out of it, sweetheart," Snake warned. "Unless you want us to take our business elsewhere." Pete's diner had been struggling lately, and everyone knew losing the bikers' business would hurt the restaurant financially. Harold put a gentle hand on Linda's shoulder. "It's all right," he said softly. "Just a little spill. There was something different in his eyes today, a spark of determination that hadn't been there before. As Harold stood there, coffee dripping from his pants, he noticed something interesting. The bikers' motorcycles were lined up outside the window, and his trained eye couldn't help but assess them. He saw modifications that weren't quite right, riding positions that showed inexperience, and maintenance issues that any serious rider should have fixed. The sight brought back memories of his time in the military's elite motorcycle reconnaissance unit. He remembered the precise maneuvers they had to master, the silent operations behind enemy lines, and the skills that had kept him and his fellow soldiers alive. "Hey, Grandpa," Snake called out, "while you're standing there dripping coffee, why don't you tell us about your great military achievements? Did they give you those fancy pins for serving coffee to the real soldiers?" Harold turned slowly to face the bikers. The diner had gone completely silent, with every customer watching to see what would happen next. Even Pete had stopped wiping the counter, his hand gripping the dishcloth tightly. "Young man," Harold said, his voice steady and clear, "those pins were earned in the Pacific, where I served with the Devil's Brigade. We rode motorcycles behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence that saved thousands of lives." The bikers exchanged glances, momentarily thrown off by Harold's direct response. Snake recovered quickly, standing up to face the old veteran. "Prove it," Snake challenged. "Show us what you've got, old man, or are those just stories you tell to impress people?" Harold looked at the biker leader calmly, years of combat experience evident in his steady gaze. "Perhaps I will," he replied. "In fact, I have a proposition for you and your friends." The other customers in the diner leaned forward, sensing that something important was about to happen. Pete moved closer, ready to intervene if needed, but Harold raised his hand slightly, signaling that he had everything under control. What the Thunder Raiders didn't realize was that their constant bullying had awakened something in Harold, a part of himself he hadn't called upon in decades. The old warrior was ready to teach these young men a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. That evening, as Harold sat in his garage, he pulled an old tarp off something he hadn't shown anyone in years. Underneath was his perfectly maintained 1942 Harley-Davidson Doliole military motorcycle. The bike was a piece of history, one that had carried him through some of the most dangerous missions during World War II. He ran his wrinkled hand along the leather seat, memories flooding back from his time in the Devil's Brigade. Few people knew about this elite unit, and even fewer knew about their secret missions. Harold had been one of their best riders, chosen specifically for his ability to handle a motorcycle in any condition. As he polished the chrome with a soft cloth, Harold remembered the night missions. His unit would ride through enemy territory with special modifications that made their motorcycles nearly silent. They gathered intelligence that saved countless Allied lives, though their stories were rarely told in history books. "You and I have one more mission, old friend," Harold whispered to the bike, his voice filled with determination. The motorcycle's restored paint still gleamed like new, a testament to Harold's dedication in maintaining it all these years. The next morning, Harold arrived at Pete's diner right on schedule. The Thunder Raiders were already there, making their usual noise and bothering other customers. Snake looked up as Harold entered, ready with another insult, but stopped short when he saw the change in the old veteran's demeanor. Harold walked straight to the biker's table. The diner fell silent as everyone watched. Even Linda stopped pouring coffee, curious about what was about to happen. "I have a challenge for you," Harold said, his voice clear and strong. "A motorcycle skills competition. Your best rider against me." The bikers burst out laughing, but Snake held up his hand to quiet them. There was something in Harold's eyes that made him curious. "You're serious, old-timer?" Snake asked, leaning forward. "You actually ride?" Harold nodded. "I do. And I propose a wager. If I win, you and your friends apologize to everyone in this diner, and you never harass another customer here again." "And if we win?" Snake asked, a smirk spreading across his face. "Then I'll give up my booth, my morning routine, and never come back to Pete's diner," Harold replied calmly. The other customers gasped. They knew how much his morning routine meant to him. Snake stood up, towering over Harold. "You're on, old man. But let me warn you, I've won 3 state championships in motorcycle skills competitions. What makes you think you stand a chance?" Harold smiled slightly. "Experience." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, faded photograph. It showed a young soldier on a military motorcycle executing a perfect jump over rough terrain while carrying vital intelligence documents. The bikers gathered around the photograph, their expressions changing as they realized they were looking at a much younger Harold. In the picture, he wore the same determined expression they saw now. That was taken in 1944, Harold explained. Behind enemy lines in the Pacific, our unit specialized in motorcycle reconnaissance. We had to be better than good, lives depended on it. The photograph made its way around the diner. Regular customers who had known Harold for years saw him in a new light. Pete picked up the photo last, studying it with newfound respect for his old friend. The competition will be this Saturday, Harold continued. At the old fairgrounds. Bring whatever obstacles and challenges you want. Snake tried to maintain his tough appearance, but uncertainty had crept into his expression. You're really serious about this, at your age? Age is just a number, Harold replied, taking back his photograph. Skill, on the other hand, that's something time can't take away. As Harold walked to his usual booth, the diner burst into excited whispers. Pete hurried over with his coffee, a concerned look on his face. Are you sure about this, Harold? Pete asked quietly. These guys aren't just weekend riders. Harold smiled as he unfolded his napkin. Neither am I, Pete. Neither am I. News of the upcoming motorcycle challenge spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By Friday, it seemed everyone in town was talking about the 93-year-old veteran who dared to challenge the Thunder Raiders. The local newspaper even ran a front-page story titled, World War II Hero Takes Stand Against Bullies. Harold spent the week preparing both himself and his motorcycle. Each evening, he worked in his garage, checking every bolt and connection on his 1942 Harley-Davidson. The familiar smell of oil and leather brought back memories of his training days, when he first learned to handle the powerful machine. On Friday afternoon, Tommy, the paperboy, stopped by Harold's house. Mr. Thompson, he called out, peering into the open garage. Can I help you polish your bike? Harold smiled and handed Tommy a clean rag. As they worked together, more people started showing up. Mr. Miller from the pharmacy brought his tools. Sarah from the flower shop arrived with sandwiches. Soon, Harold's driveway was filled with townspeople, all wanting to help prepare for tomorrow's challenge. Tell us about your missions, Harold, someone asked as they worked. The old veteran rarely spoke about the war, but today felt different. Our unit was special, Harold began, adjusting a mirror on his motorcycle. We rode through enemy territory at night, gathering information about troop movements and supply lines. Our bikes were modified to run almost silently. One wrong move, one loose piece of equipment rattling, and we'd be discovered. The crowd listened in amazement as Harold described dangerous missions and close calls. Children sat cross-legged on the driveway, hanging on every word. Even some of the adults found themselves holding their breath during the more intense parts of his stories. Meanwhile, across town at the fairgrounds, the Thunder Raiders were setting up the obstacle course for tomorrow's competition. Snake had designed it to be especially difficult, with tight turns, narrow pathways, and challenging jumps. No way that old man can handle this course, Razor laughed, helping to position a barrier. He'll probably give up before he even starts. But Snake wasn't so sure anymore. He had done some research about the Devil's Brigade and discovered that they were indeed an elite unit, known for their exceptional motorcycle skills and dangerous missions. For the first time, he felt a hint of doubt about tomorrow's competition. Back at Harold's house, Pete arrived with unexpected news. Harold, he said excitedly, I've been getting calls all day. Veterans from 3 neighboring counties are coming tomorrow to support you. They say they won't let a fellow serviceman stand alone. Harold nodded, touched by the support but remaining focused on his preparation. He opened a worn leather bag and pulled out his old riding gear, the same outfit he wore in the photograph. The leather was still supple, carefully preserved over the decades. As evening approached, Linda from the diner brought hot coffee for everyone. She watched Harold start up his motorcycle, the engine purring perfectly after all these years. That sound, Harold said, smiling. That's the sound of freedom. During the war, this bike wasn't just transportation, it was a lifeline. We had to trust our machines as much as we trusted each other. Before everyone left for the night, Harold's garage had been transformed into a military motorcycle museum. His old maps, compass, and mission photographs were displayed on a makeshift table. Each item told part of a story that most people had never known about their quiet neighbor. "Get some rest, Harold," Pete said, patting his friend's shoulder. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day." Harold looked at his motorcycle one last time before closing the garage door. "Win or lose," he said quietly, "tomorrow these young men will learn that respect isn't about age or appearance. It's about character." As darkness fell over Millbrook, two very different groups prepared for tomorrow's challenge. The Thunder Raiders, confident but uncertain, and Harold, calm and ready to show that some skills never fade away. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. By 8 o'clock, the old fairgrounds were packed with more people than Millbrook had seen in years. Cars lined both sides of the street for 3 blocks, and a steady stream of motorcycles rumbled in, carrying veterans from all over the state. The Thunder Raiders arrived to find the fairgrounds transformed. Someone had hung American flags along the obstacle course, and a large banner read "Devil's Brigade rides again." Snake and his gang looked less confident as they watched the crowd grow. At exactly 9 o'clock, a familiar sound made everyone turn their heads. Harold was riding toward the fairgrounds on his restored military motorcycle, wearing his original leather riding gear. The morning sun glinted off the polished chrome of his bike, and his military cap sat proudly on his head. The crowd parted as Harold rode through, veterans standing at attention and saluting as he passed. Children pointed excitedly, and many people took pictures with their phones. The old veteran looked like he had stepped right out of his wartime photograph. "That's a museum piece," Razor shouted, trying to sound tough. "It belongs in a display case, not on a race course." Harold dismounted smoothly, his movements showing years of practice. A group of veterans immediately surrounded him, introducing themselves and sharing their own service stories. One elderly man had tears in his eyes as he shook Harold's hand. "My father served in the Pacific," the man said. "He told me stories about the motorcycle units that saved their lives by warning them about enemy positions. That might have been you." The town mayor arrived to officially start the competition. He explained the rules to the gathered crowd. The challenge would have 3 parts: precision riding through a tight obstacle course, a speed trial, and finally, a special skills demonstration. Snake stepped forward, wearing new leather racing gear covered in sponsor patches. He would ride first, showing what modern motorcycle skills looked like. His bike was a latest model sports motorcycle, gleaming with custom modifications. The younger rider started his run impressively. Snake weaved through the cones with speed, jumped the ramps smoothly, and handled the tight turns with skill. The Thunder Raiders cheered as he completed the course in what seemed like record time. "Beat that, old-timer," Snake called out, high-fiving his friends, but his smile faded when he saw Harold's calm expression. Harold pulled on his leather gloves slowly and deliberately. Pete walked over to wish him luck, but Harold just smiled. "In the war," he said quietly, "we didn't need luck. We needed skill and courage. Today, I'll show them the difference." Before mounting his motorcycle, Harold walked the course slowly, studying each obstacle. The veterans in the crowd recognized what he was doing. It was standard military procedure to assess the terrain before a mission. "He's reading the course like we used to read enemy territory," one veteran explained to the crowd. "Every detail matters when your life depends on it." Linda from the diner had made a special area for older spectators to sit comfortably. Mrs. Martinez was there with her twins, who were waving small American flags. Tommy the paperboy had climbed a tree to get a better view, and Mr. Miller closed his pharmacy to be there. As Harold finally sat on his motorcycle, a deep silence fell over the fairgrounds. He started the engine, and the sound of the vintage Harley-Davidson echoed across the field. It was a different sound from modern bikes, deeper, more powerful, like a piece of history coming alive. "Ready when you are, sir," the mayor called out respectfully. Harold looked at the course ahead of him, his hands resting easily on the handlebars. 93 years of life experience, including years of military service, had prepared him for this moment. He wasn't just riding for himself, he was riding for every veteran who had ever been disrespected, for every elderly person who had been underestimated. The flag dropped, and history was about to be made at the Millbrook Fairgrounds. The moment Harold's motorcycle moved forward, everyone knew they were watching something special. The vintage Harley-Davidson didn't just move through the course, it danced. Harold's body seemed to become one with the machine, every movement smooth and purposeful. He approached the first set of obstacles, a series of tight combs that Snake had barely managed to weave through. Harold didn't just weave. He glided between them with a precision that made it look easy. His turns were perfect, each one calculated to the inch, using techniques that had once helped him avoid enemy patrols. "Look at that control," a veteran in the crowd shouted. "That's old-school military training right there." The Thunder Raiders watched in stunned silence as Harold approached the ramp section. Snake had shown off with flashy jumps, but Harold demonstrated something different. His bike left the ground with such perfect balance that it seemed to float. He landed each jump exactly where he wanted to, the vintage suspension handling the impact like it was designed for this moment. Next came the speed trial portion. Snake had relied on his modern bike's power, but Harold showed that speed wasn't just about the machine. He shifted his weight perfectly on each turn, letting physics work in his favor. The sound of his motorcycle's engine echoed across the fairgrounds like a war cry from the past. "He's not just riding," Pete explained to the amazed crowd. "He's showing us how they did it in the war, when every move had to be perfect because lives depended on it." The most challenging part of the course was a narrow bridge that crossed over a shallow creek. Snake had crossed it cautiously, knowing one wrong move would mean a wet landing. Harold approached it differently. He accelerated slightly, using the momentum to keep the bike perfectly straight. The veterans in the crowd nodded in recognition. It was a technique used for crossing narrow bridges under enemy fire. As Harold entered the final stretch, something unexpected happened. He didn't just complete the course, he added his own flourish. In a move that made everyone gasp, he executed a perfect figure-8 pattern, his vintage motorcycle leaning at angles that seemed impossible for both the bike and its 93-year-old rider. "That's a Devil's Brigade signature move," an elderly veteran shouted excitedly. "They used it to confuse enemy observers about their direction of travel." The Thunder Raiders stood with their mouths open. Snake's recent championship runs suddenly seemed amateur compared to what they were witnessing. This wasn't just motorcycle riding. This was living history, a demonstration of skills honed in the heat of war. Harold completed the course with a final maneuver that brought his motorcycle to a stop exactly where he had started. The crowd erupted in cheers. Veterans saluted, children jumped up and down, and even some of the Thunder Raiders found themselves clapping. The mayor stepped forward, stopwatch in hand, his face showing disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "not only did Mr. Thompson complete the course with perfect precision, but his time." He paused for effect. His time was 3 seconds faster than his younger competitor. The fairgrounds exploded with celebration. Pete rushed forward to help Harold off his bike, but the old veteran dismounted smoothly on his own. His face showed no sign of tiredness. Instead, there was a familiar glint in his eyes, the same one from his wartime photograph. Linda ran up with a bottle of water, but Harold politely declined. During missions, he said with a small smile, "We couldn't stop for water breaks. Guess some habits stay with you." Snake made his way through the crowd toward Harold. The biker's face had lost its usual arrogant expression, replaced by something that looked like respect. He stopped a few feet from Harold, suddenly unsure what to say to the man he had spent weeks mocking. The whole crowd fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next between the young biker leader and the veteran who had just schooled him in the art of motorcycle riding. Snake stood before Harold, his tough guy image forgotten. For a moment, the young biker leader struggled to find the right words. Then, to everyone's surprise, he slowly removed his leather jacket and held it respectfully in his hands. "Sir," Snake said, his voice different from the mocking tone he had used for weeks, "I owe you an apology. We all do." He turned to face the crowd gathered at Pete's diner. "What we saw today wasn't just riding. It was a piece of history. We've been disrespecting a true hero." The other Thunder Raiders joined their leader, forming a line in front of Harold. One by one, they removed their caps in respect. Razor, who had been one of the most vocal in mocking Harold, stepped forward. "My grandfather fought in World War II, Razor said quietly. "He never made it home. Watching you ride today was like seeing what he might have been like." His eyes were wet with tears he didn't try to hide. Harold looked at the young men before him, seeing not the bullies they had been, but the people they could become. He reached into his riding jacket and pulled out something that made the crowd gasp, a small, worn notebook. "During the war," Harold said, his voice carrying across the silent fairgrounds, "we kept records of every mission, but more importantly, We kept records of every lesson learned. He opened the notebook carefully. Would you like to know how we modified our bikes for silent running? Or how we maintained them in the jungle? Snake's eyes widened. You'd share that with us, after how we treated you? Harold smiled. In the war, we learned that enemies can become friends. Sometimes, all it takes is understanding each other. He looked around at the gathered crowd. Pete, I think we might need to push some tables together at the diner. These young men and I have some stories to share. The next morning, Pete's diner was more crowded than ever. The Thunder Raiders sat with Harold at an extended table, listening intently as he showed them his wartime photographs and diagrams. Their motorcycles were parked respectfully beside Harold's vintage Harley-Davidson. See this modification here? Harold explained, pointing to a page in his notebook. This helped us move through enemy territory without making a sound. We had to be creative with what we had. The bikers took notes, asked questions, and showed genuine interest in every detail. Other customers watched in amazement as the same young men who had caused so much trouble now treated Harold like a respected teacher. Linda moved between tables with coffee refills, smiling at the transformation. The Martinez twins sat nearby, no longer afraid but fascinated by the stories. Even old Bill Jenkins joined the group, sharing his own memories of the war years. You know what? Snake said during a break in the stories. We'd be honored if you'd consider being an honorary member of the Thunder Raiders. We could learn a lot from you, sir. Harold touched his military cap thoughtfully. On one condition, he said. The Thunder Raiders start using their skills to help the community. Maybe escort veteran parades, or teach motorcycle safety to young riders? Yes, sir. The bikers agreed enthusiastically. From that day forward, Pete's diner changed. Every morning, Harold still had his usual breakfast, but now he was joined by members of the Thunder Raiders. They became protectors of the diner instead of troublemakers, greeting customers with respect and helping elderly patrons to their seats. The story of the 93-year-old veteran who transformed a motorcycle gang spread far beyond Millbrook. But for Harold, the best reward was seeing the young men discover that true strength isn't about intimidation. It's about character, respect, and using your skills to help others. And every now and then, on quiet evenings, the people of Millbrook would smile as they heard the sound of motorcycles, a vintage Harley-Davidson leading a group of bikes through town, a reminder that it's never too late to change, and that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources.